and like you mentioned too, it's not just 100 milers anymore. It's not just like these iconic trail races. We have projects like what Tara just did on the Appalachian Trail, like just mind-boggling. Like the amount of just length with something like that to wrap your head around it, and then to go out and finish. What was her finishing? It was 40 days. What was it exactly again?
It was so 40 days of the exact number here. It was 40 days, 18 hours, and 6 minutes flat. Which Carl Sabi's record, he went northbound, but still was the fastest time at the time. 41 days, 7 hours, and 39 minutes. So pretty much shaved off nearly a day, which is just amazing on the overall record, which is the coolest thing ever. The coolest thing about the attempt, too, two different things kind of stand out to me. Like the first thing is like she did hard rock. Like she did hard rock before
Yeah,
this as
that's right.
well, which is so freaking cool, right? And so I think like that's a cool thing. And she was talking on a podcast that she did with Finn Melanson on Single Track, like saying that she was getting a lot of people saying this is a bad idea and everything. But for her, she was like, I think that prepared me, like to be able to do like an 100-mile training day over all these mountains and everything like that too. Like, and if you look at Tara, like she races a lot. She's on
Mhm.
the I don't know if she'll go through this, and I gotta ask her, but she's on the race list for Javelina. Like she's on the entrance list. Is she? If I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if she does it. You know what I mean? Like if you look at her races over the years, she crams in tons of races in there too. So I think she just has a lot of that experience to like, really like put herself to these big efforts and recover super fast. Which leads to the second thing I think is the coolest thing about the attempt. Like she was so behind on the overall record like the first few weeks into it. Like she was
Mhm.
lagging behind. I think she was behind by like a run rate of like 100 miles or something like that, which is huge. And then she like, went from like 40s, 40-mile-ish days to then 50s and 60s, cut her sleep out and just like pretty much from like a mileage perspective, like negative split it, which is just
Mhm.
so cool to see because usually it's harder to do that in these longer distance events from what you kind of see anecdotally. So, but I think it has just raised the bar for like, man, like, and Tara even says this too. She talks about it. It's like, women can shoot for these overall like men records. They can go for it. And like the gap is closing. And it's just such a cool thing to see her do that. Like, not just for women, but just for what humans can do.
Mhm.
I think, in my opinion, I'm curious to see what you think, but I think this is the performance of the year for ultra running so far. That
Yeah,
I would say so.
it's got to be up there. I mean, the argument against that would be just like, is the is the category something that wouldn't be?
Right.
Because I mean, FKTs and events, it's hard to like compare because you don't have like someone racing you. But I mean, if we just look at like what was the most impressive feat in ultra running this
Yeah.
year, it's certainly up with a couple different performances. Um, yeah, and I mean, what you said about her pacing strategy is interesting to me too, because I think this is just a conversation where I mean, I've gone back and forth on this. I think like anytime I start feeling like I've kind of got it narrowed down a little bit more specifically as to like what the best pacing strategy is, something happens that sort of kind of like adds evidence to the other side. It's like it's almost timed perfectly for me when I'm just starting to get confident. It's just like, nope. And then you see something happen. I mean, like David Roche's Leadville, which
Yeah.
that's something else that happened since we last recorded too, is like
True.
one thing when I had him on, I think you had him on your podcast too.
Hmm.
It seemed like David was on all of the podcasts, which
Made the
he should be
rounds.
after. Yeah, he should be after that. But one thing I wanted to really try to get inside his head about with the time when he came on mine was like, how did he feel in that kind of final 20 miles in terms of
Mm,
just like his motivation to push, how fresh did his legs feel? Because he had a pretty big positive split, and one of my arguments that I've been more convinced by with, like, a more even to negative split strategy is that that strategy is gonna put you in a position where you're gonna feel better maybe at the end of this race versus this inevitable kind of, like, what I think most people think is death march type mentality necessary in order to, like, maybe you're not actually death marching, but it's gonna feel like it's gonna be
right.
way more difficult where when you mentally unpack the race, you're thinking like there was the first 70, 80 miles, and then there was the last 20, 30, and the last 20, 30 carries so much mental weight. Whereas when you negative split, the mental weight balance, to me, the way I've perceived this historically for myself has been it's more distributed evenly. So you don't feel like you're
Yeah.
taking on way more of that at certain points. So I wanted to try to figure out it was kind of tough with David because he's a first-time 100-mile finisher, so he
Mm.
really didn't have a perspective to weight against other than some other ultra marathons, which carry some value, but I think there's some specifics as you move to different distances that would be important, which just makes me more excited to see him do more 100 miling because I don't think he's gonna always have days like he had at Leadville, and then maybe he'll have some perspectives that he can start kinda comparing this one to.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what he does at Javelina in just a few weeks too.
Mhm,
Yeah, I and it is a really interesting thing too because like I think all the time you think of first time 100 miler and like there's so much unique experience from that. Like I think even you coached me through my first 100 miler too, and I do remember like you telling me you're like yeah like once you get to that unknown it is a hard place to be and you need to take care of yourself up front to not get it so hard at the end. And I think even a lot of that weight carries more so in your first time going through the distance. So it's going to be interesting to see how he handles that at Javelina, where it's like now he knows what 100 miles feels like. Objectively, it's going to be a shorter time on course if he has even a great day out there, even like not his best day, right? Like just from like a time perspective with the less vert and altitude. But you know, who knows? Like, I mean, like, is anything gonna be different with the heat? Is anything gonna be different with the running that's in there relative to the vert? Like, so and you have some times when people they have like amazing performances and then maybe not, but I think it's cool because he's very much cognizant of that from what I've been hearing. Like he's like yeah like this is like the second sample size in an experiment he's kind of running through 100-mile training, so it'll be cool to see. And yeah, I mean we can talk about like the Javelina stuff too, but I think you've told me this too, and I think it's so true. It's like a really beautifully raced ran at Javelina as your first and fifth loops are the fastest. And I could be wrong, but I don't know if that's been the case over the past couple of years. Just because I
mhm,
even think with golden tickets races, it's skewing more positive split. Whereas like if you look at someone like Tara, like she like mastered like the negative mileage split on a very long effort, and look how it paid off. So yeah,
mhm.
it always gets me curious to see what's going to happen this year when it's going to be so brutally hot compared to the last few years. But
Yeah.
it's an
I
enigma.
think I think with, like, pacing strategy, if you pinned me down and said, "Okay, I wanna know what your current view of this is," I would say, like, I think, like, if you can put yourself in a vacuum and just
Mm,
say, "What strategy is gonna produce the fastest pace for me?"
mm,
It's gonna be some relatively small margin to either side of even.
mm,
But, like, if it's not negative, that doesn't mean like, the big question is, like, where is that margin, that range? Like, is it 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%? You could keep going and going. And let's say we establish that, then is there any variance inside of there that would be more beneficial for you to employ based on what actually happens, which is a race
mm.
where there's other people out there performing? And I
Yes.
think when you get the level of competition that we see at Western States and Javelina now, the best argument for a positive split to me would be a positive split that's not drastic, so probably inside a few percentage points of even, but it's putting you in a position where you're in the race because you're
Yeah.
not letting so I if what ultimately ends up happening is you get, like, a couple dozen guys going with that strategy, and only a handful of them are actually gonna be able to execute it right because they got their numbers crunched properly and their pacing and their capabilities properly calibrated, and then they're the ones who ultimately end up having that, like, slight positive split, whereas everyone else kinda blows up and has a really big positive split, or I guess the curious part about that would be if someone sat back and kinda tries to do what I did tried to do last year. I didn't execute it perfectly by any stretch, but, like, sit back and let kind of that lead pack go and then work your way up into the field.
Mm,
Is there margin for like someone who is like faster? Let's say there was like someone who employed my strategy from last year, but was a little faster than me and was able to get down into that kind of low 13, high 12-hour range. Um, are they gonna is that something that's just a psychological battle for the individual to be able to kind of sit off of
mm,
the very front and then all of a sudden like pop in there at the very end and steal it? Like, how likely is that? Is there an opportunity for that still? Is it too much stress to be sitting that
mm.
far back? I think there's a lot of individual components there and psychology there that you could make arguments at the individual level for, like, doing it or not doing it. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you.
Yeah, and even just thinking about that too, I think Aid Station Fireball did like some stats on it, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember hearing something along the lines of like for I think it was both the men's and the women's field, if like any of those athletes like weren't in the top 10 after like the finish of like loop one or something, like the chance of a golden ticket is like significantly small.
Mhm.
And it's like I think maybe you hear that as like an athlete and you're like, well, I got to be in the top 10, I got to be in the hunt, or hear it all the time. It's like I got to keep my eye on like where the first is, right? And of
Mhm.
course there's going to be people who get dragged out and led on like the really fast stuff as well too. So I think it's a really interesting component to kind of think about, just because there is that competition, there is like playing the field, there is all that stuff as well too. And you know I think maybe over time, like once we've kind of, I don't want to say like hit parity in the sport with a lot of people with like stuff like that, but I think it just takes someone like a Nick Curry or like you who like go through and like execute these strategies to like one day kind of show it. Like I think it's Scott Traer in Black Canyon 3 years ago, right? I think he was in, I don't remember the exact number, like 30th place or something, like going into like Bumblebee or something like that. He was like way far back, and then dude gets a golden ticket, right? Like comes
Yeah.
comes in the top three. And he's been like a guy similar with you. I mean, even last year, like you and I were running in the beginning, I think we were like 20th place or something like that. And then, you creeped up into top 10, which is awesome at the end. Running sub 14. Like that's great. And so I'm curious to see like how that shakes out if the strategy does, because like it just seems like a lot of people just run hard and hold on for dear life at the end. And to me, it's just hard to think at like a mileage, like 100 miles, that it's hard to kind of go for, right? And then I look at people like Tara, how she's able to close so freaking strong at the end.
Mhm.
And granted, like, right, like to go to your point too, like for her, the only person she's like racing at is the ghost of Karel Sabi, right? Like
Yeah.
that's who she's racing out there. But there's no person, like there's no people in front of her, like, and so like I wonder with those kind of attempts, like if it almost like takes it a lot off, or even in these like fixed time events, if you're trying to go for like a certain record or something like that. I know you have a lot more experience in that realm than I have, like having just it like being like, okay, this is me against the clock or me against like that, if that conducively has someone to be more trusting of a negative or an even split than trying to go absolutely balls out in the beginning and just hold on at the end just to be at the front.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think part of me wants to think of it in the sense that if you really want to truly find your full potential, just the idea of planning a negative split is a hard sell because it's sort of putting yourself in a situation where you're going to limit yourself to some degree.
Mm,
Whereas like you have a race like that David had at Leadville, like he's either having a historic day for himself or he's blowing up epically. Those are kind of the options on the table.
mm,
And I think it works sometimes. So it almost becomes this thing where do you want to really, really figure out what you're capable of and know, like, okay, I could not have gone faster than that? Or
mm,
do you want to stack a bunch of like relatively close to your potential events, but not necessarily know for sure if you could have gone a little bit faster? Um, I mean, you could, I guess, assume a negative splits on the table that really isn't, and then but be close enough where you actually
mm,
run a slight positive, and then you do find that. So that's the argument. You could go back and forth. So really, what this comes down to is the number of opportunities or how many swings you take at this particular thing.
yeah.
And with ultra running, it gets a little goofy because it's like these are long, stressful races. There's also like tons of variance amongst them. Very few people are targeting the exact same event over and over again, the way you'd see for like fast marathon running and things like that. Most people are going from, or most people are like what David's doing. He did Leadville. Now he's going to do Javelina. If he does well at Javelina, I'm sure he'll do Western States. Three very different courses. So it's like, how do you even
Mm.
begin to compare those and decide whether your strategy was employed properly or not when you have that many different variables from one event to the next?